Kong is always able to get brilliant and interesting scholars together. But I think in this particular panel, he has pulled another trick off, which is, of course, the trick of mixing oil and water, which most people can't do, but you can. I'd like to approach the papers individually. I have some comments on them, and I have a couple of questions to each of our speakers. They're fine papers, very detailed, and I will try and deal in broad strokes and state the obvious, as is my point. David Carr has presented us with a masterful summary of China's water management issues and their effect not only at home but in South Asia, with a focus on the Tibet-Himalaya region, the source of the great rivers on which much of Asia's population depends. Let me focus your attention on a couple of key passages in Professor Carr's paper. The first one, page 11, hydropolitics is still politics. Well spoken, although it wasn't you that said so, I believe. And of course, hydropolitics is geopolitics as well. The second one is that global climate change is happening within a world political system of sovereign states. Thus, water in Tibet, like minerals in Tibet or religion in Tibet, is an issue of sovereignty. And although, again, the wonderful spin doctrine of the Indian research group, the Indian military research group, trying to divide Tibet and China, despite that, it's an issue of effectively Chinese sovereignty, with China as sovereign state. And I think the other thing that again, was emphasized in the presentation was the checklist of things that are likely to be trouble in transboundary water issues, with China and South Asian neighbors coming out a perfect 6 for 6. Madam Dai Ching will be talking on Monday about the Three Gorges and the Yangtze in terms of the internal problems caused by what I think she will tell us was bad science, autocratic planning, the forced dislocation of millions for a mega project, and probably more besides. David Carr's paper looks at the effect that might happen with dams on the Brahmaputra, and also something that I've only been aware of relatively recently, the damming of the Lanshan on the Chinese side, the Mekong on the South Asian side. I mean, this I think is going to be a huge issue between China and its neighbors, which are dependent on the Mekong, and one that I would like to hear Professor Carr talking a bit more about. The paper was generally, as I confessed to its author, a rather disturbing and distressing read. But yet it ends with a kind of moment of light on page 16. The water, food, energy, climate change chain, or what might be called ecological color revolutions, are liable to induce what Professor Carr refers to as mobilization, which seems to me a slightly euphemistic term. I'm not sure if that's the case. And yet, he says, suppositions of inevitable water or other resource wars are ill-founded. You dealt with that to some extent in your presentation, but given the perfect 6 for 6 on their checklist and the damming of the Brahmaputra and the Lanshan and all the rest of it, I would like you to elaborate perhaps a little bit on why such fears would be ill-founded. On to Professor Christopherson's paper, which is a most thorough and extremely valuable comparative assessment of the behavior of 3 major consumers towards a couple of relatively minor producers. The different approaches taken by Japan, China, and the US in Uzbekistan and Myanmar are a microcosm of their behavior globally. Rather than dealing with the specifics of the case studies, I'd like, as I warned, to state the obvious and offer some generalities from someone outside the fields both of international trade and human security, and perhaps interrogate the premises on which this paper is founded. The first general comment is the most obvious of all, perhaps, and that is that fossil fuels in general, and because we're talking about oil today, oil in particular, are just simply dirty businesses. They're physically dirty, as anyone who lives on the Gulf Coast will recall, as anybody who lives around the tar sands in northern Alberta will tell you, and closer to home, as people who live on the Pacific coast will say as they see tankers going past and remember the Exxon Valdez. It's a dirty business physically, and as Professor Christopherson's paper points out, it's a dirty business politically as well. And it's going to get dirtier as oil has to be got from more inaccessible, more environmentally sensitive, and more politically unstable places to fuel our collectively insatiable appetite. And since we're talking about China, China's insatiable appetite in particular. A second point, which again is an obvious one, but as we talk about China, it maybe tends to get forgotten, is that we have been complicit, all of us, in China's thirst for oil, both by our appetite for their cheap products and our exporting of our own dirty industries, and by setting the benchmark for a fossil-fueled lifestyle. A third observation, which again is a sort of an obvious one, and that is that states and corporations will behave as badly overseas as their hosts permit, and as their home constituencies will tolerate. This includes low wages and poor hiring conditions of the people who made my bicycle, atrocities committed by the rulers of Burma and Sudan, and the Canadian export of asbestos, just to give a little Canadian content and to prove that we are not as innocent as we sometimes think we are. States hold themselves and others up to different benchmarks. Generally speaking, they hold themselves up to their own benchmarks favorably and others unfavorably, and judge others more sternly than they judge themselves. Let's start with the Western benchmarks, which are the ones that we have largely been dealing with and that Professor Christopherson was using. Human rights, human security, especially those of indigenous peoples, are extremely important to Western countries who insist on them, having forgotten that most of their wealth in the period of the Industrial Revolution was based on slavery, and that they did away with their own indigenous peoples in a particularly ruthless way. But these are the benchmarks by which we judge others, and the benchmarks by which China judges us: non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. As Gabriel points out, of course they interfere in the affairs of other states, but they don't invade them, which is the criterion to which they hold other people in terms of non-interference. And so you have what has been referred to again in the Canadian case as two solitudes here. You have people holding up different sets of criteria as benchmarks for good international behavior, giving themselves a passing grade and the other side a failing grade. So where are the benchmarks acceptable to everybody? Clearly they ought to be found at the United Nations. Clearly they will not be found in the opinions of Nobel Peace Laureates, given the little bit of bother around the current Nobel Peace Laureate. What is going to change China's international behavior, and what is going to make China perhaps a more responsible industrial citizen? The most plausible answer to me is the answer that Dai-Chin gave us last night in her very interesting exchange with Professor Badesky. And essentially she feels that the present Chinese middle class, not a Zichan Jieji, but a Zhongchan Jieji, is not in a position to exercise any kind of constraint over the actions of the Chinese state because they are beneficiaries and complicit in those actions. What would be needed, I think, is the existence of a thinking Chinese class, a class of Chinese public intellectuals, of which Madame Dai Qing is herself a most shining example, to be the equivalent of the kinds of communities that we have in the West, which say that perhaps we don't want to buy soccer balls stitched by child labor or by other products which are made by convict labor. That is, I think, the pressure that is more likely to work. That constituency is more likely to work than the UN or the Nobel laureates. If hydropolitics is still politics, then oil politics is even more so still politics, and perhaps an even more desperate business than hydropolitics are. It's an absolutely fascinating study, and I would love to see Professor Christopherson go to other unpleasant places to continue her study. And perhaps I might suggest Nigeria or Ethiopia as her next stop. It's a really very important line of inquiry, and you have to boldly go to places where I don't want to go. On to Gabriel's paper, another splendid and very thoroughly researched paper, which, if I might say so, reflects credit on the young scholar and his PhD supervisor as well. This one focusing on Burma. Burma is important and interesting as a source of energy and raw material, as well, of course, as a conduit for energy supply, a consumer of Chinese products, and as essentially, if we're talking about sovereign states, as a buffer state. It's also a particularly good case study for those of us who are involved in Asia because of its notoriety, as outlined in Gabriel's paper. We have conflict, corruption, continued detention of a Nobel Peace Laureate, that's one of two Nobel Peace Laureates in continued detention, an almost uneducated population, catastrophic poverty, and more besides. It's also been in the news and provided great visuals because the protesters wore nice yellow robes. And I'm sorry to say that that's one of the reasons why I think we know about that rather than about Uzbekistan. It's a visual thing. China is complicit, of course, in all of the terrible things that are happening in Burma, and we are less so. But what about other complicities? You mentioned that China is not Burma's leading trade partner. Thailand is. Is Thailand completely off the hook here? I think as we focus on China and its often egregious international behavior, there's a tendency to look away from other places. Just as I have felt in listening to the papers and reading the papers, that it's as if Russia is off the map today, and I don't think it can be off the map. Somehow other misbehaviors are off the map too because we're focused in on China. Is your study, Gabriel, I guess, a convenient way not only to focus on the misdeeds of one state, but to focus away from the misdeeds of other states? And with that, I leave you. Thank you very much.